Laheating! Hello everyone and welcome to my Queer channel. I'm your host Queer-chan, and today we are continuing our look at the variety of Hasbro Neimoidian Star Wars figures. Now, last video, of course, we started off with what I liked to call ground zero of my Neimoidian collection, that of course being the 1999 Episode 1 Nute Gunray figure. And of course, it would only be natural to follow up that review with his counterpart, Rune Haako, again, from the 1999 Episode 1 variety of figures. Now, I cannot remember if there were more than one wave in the Episode 1 line of figures, and if there were more than one wave, which waves Gunray and Haako were included in. I know, for example, the 2002 Saga line of figures had about, I think, 3 or 4 different waves. We'll get to that at a later date, obviously, because the Lot Dot figure is included in that set. But again, I say, as I said in my last video, I was young, very young, when the figures and the film came out. So I have next to no recollection of what this was like in stores, and again my memory is failing me as to whether or not there were actually several waves within the Episode 1 line of figures. I'm sure that answer is on Rebel Scum. I probably should have looked it up before I started the video, but oh well, here we are. Before we get into the actual figure itself, just have a quick look at its single accessory. Like Nute Gunray and all the other figures within the Episode 1 line, it's, well, in this case, his sole accessory. The other figures had other accessories. Some came with blasters, some came with lightsabers, etc. Rune Haako's sole accessory is, of course, the Comtech chip, which doubles as a stand. Now, in my last video with Nute Gunray, I went into the history and details of what the Comtech chips actually were, what they did, how they differed with international distribution, so of course I'm not going to go over that again. If you're just joining us for the first time, I wholeheartedly recommend you go and have a quick look at that review if you're interested in what the Comtech chips were. There's not really too much to them. What I didn't go over is that on the back of each chip they actually give a very brief rundown of who the character is. The thing I found very interesting about Rune Haako's chip is that they've got his status as a Neimoidian Trade Viceroy, which is actually incorrect. He is the Settlement Officer for the Trade Federation. With Nute Gunray, they've got the exact same thing. Status Neimoidian, at least they spelled Neimoidian correctly, gotta give them that. Neimoidian Trade Viceroy. So, yes. This was, of course, when there probably wasn't too much information readily available about, well, anything in Episode 1, really, least of all the Neimoidians. So, it's somewhat understandable why they would put this information down erroneously. I'm not even sure if the visual dictionary was out at that point. They actually do get his job correct in the visual dictionary as a settlement officer, basically a lawyer, in other words. So yes, that's the single interesting thing about the chip. In fact, actually, I seem to remember on the packaging as well they have him labelled as a Trade Viceroy, so it's not just the chip, it was a mistake that was actually printed throughout the Episode 1 line. Speaking of the packaging, like my Nute Gunray figure, this is of course an American release, so this was of course released again under the name Comtech. I do of course, like Nute Gunray, have 2 packaged Rune Haakos. This one of course under the Comtalk line, which would have been released in different parts of Western Europe, namely I believe Germany, Belgium, France, sort of that general region. And I mentioned of course in the last video that was due to a copyright detail with a German telecommunications company which was actually called Comtech. I believe it was spelled differently, but of course it close enough so you don't actually, want to have problems with copyright. So yes, that's the European release, and of course the wider and international releases had, of course, the battle droid. exact same battle droid as in the Nute Gunray pack. A very, very, very basic piece of plastic with very minor articulation. I think that the blaster is actually moulded into his hand, so there's very little you can actually do with these, but if you're looking to actually army build, then it's actually a fairly good idea, because if you got the whole line, you could have a fairly substantial army of battle droids. And certainly, you know, about, what, 15 years later, when they released the Hasbro MTT, which I have and will go over at a later date, by the way, you, again, basically, if you're into dioramas, then you've got a great set of custom fodder and diorama fodder, really. So, yes. One thing I did actually forget to mention in my last review with Nute Gunray is that I do actually have carded versions of the American releases, the Comtech releases. Unfortunately, however, like as is the case with a number of my other pieces in my collection, they are boxed up somewhere. Which box they're in, I do not know. I've got a whole front room filled with boxes from my Star Wars collection, because there is absolutely no room to display them at the moment. So yes, just take my word for it. There isn't too much difference in the packaging, other than, as I say, just being released under the Comtech name. Now, onto the figure itself. I again said in my last video that the Neimoidians, despite the fact that they were peg warmers on shelves and more or less, of course, hated by fans from the films, had a bit of a reputation for being actually pretty superb figures for the time, and Rune Haako is no different. In fact, I think in many ways he is actually a better figure than Nute Gunray. He has just that little bit more articulation in his elbows, whereas Nute only had shoulder articulation. He's got full head articulation, which actually, on my figure at least, works better than the head articulation on the Nute Gunray figure. Very, very, very nicely detailed robes, even more so than Nute. You've got the nicely moulded, I've never really known what that is, that little bit at the back there. Some nice folds, the texturing is great. The, of course, slits in his sleeves. Beautiful, beautiful, I think, definition with the, again, with the folds in his robes. You can get a real sense of sort of the tightness of the, well, maybe not tightness, but just how the material he wears, you know, flows over him, the thickness of it, the viscosity of it, for lack of a better term. They've done an absolutely superb job of moulding him. I mean, again, I think, and I'm trying not to be biased, but I think the Neimoidians really do absolutely stand out from the episode 1 line for just being overall outstanding figures. They may not have articulation, they may not be, you know, ideal for, you know, action scenes, probably weren't very popular with children, but as figures themselves, they're superb. They really are, given that this is, again, a 1999 figure. And, of course, very much like Nute, layered robes, and even a full set of working legs, articulated and all, if I can get him to move. There you go, articulated and all under his robes. So it's not even as if that they just released, you know, a lump of plastic with a few details on top. They've done full figures with full bodies and full detailing everywhere within the robes. The only, I suppose, downside is that there's really no weathering on the robes, but at the same time you don't really need it for a figure like this, because the detail in the robes and just the monotony of them, I mean, as was in the film in general, makes it so that, again, you don't really need it. They serve their purpose, you know, as they are. On the face and the skin, however, the weathering is outstanding. The only thing that's always bugged me about this is I've got a tiny spot, tiny spot of paint on his robes on this hand, but you know what, it doesn't really matter to me. The, as I say, paint job is outstanding. They've done a really good job sculpting those, you know, those lovely long Neimoidian fingers. They've just done a superb job with the Neimoidian figures. I cannot say it enough. Go around so you can see the back of his head. Beautiful detailing in the skin folds and the wrinkles on his head. They've actually got his headgear correct, unlike the Nute Gunray figure, which again I think makes this a slightly better figure because it is that much more accurate to his film representation. And then, of course, the beautiful eyes, even more so, if it wants to focus, come on Rune, there you go, even more so than on the Nute Gunray figure. Nice shiny gold paint rather. Nice pupils on top. I actually have a number of Rune Haako figures there. It's a bit of a funny story really. I used a few of them to customise some other figures a few years back. The first Rune, however, that I bought for customising, it was actually it was such a beautiful example of the figure. It's not this one, but it was such a beautiful example of the figure that I actually couldn't bring myself to cut it up and, you know, turn it into a different character. So I actually ended up spending money on even more Rune figures to customise simply because I couldn't bring myself to break that one apart. But the point I'm trying to make there is that I've got, as I said, I've had a number of Rune Haako figures over the years, and most of them actually have red detailing on the eyes as well. Funnily enough, the one that I've got in my collection, sort of this main one, is the only one that actually doesn't seem to have that red detailing. You can see it a tiny bit in his right eye, so sort of our left. But elsewhere, just sort of that plain gold, which looks absolutely fine, but in all fairness, I probably actually should have chosen the more beautiful example to show for this video, because again, the paintwork on the eyes and the paintwork, it's just the paintwork in general, it was such a beautiful example of that figure. Again, I actually can't even remember where I put it at this point. It might be with my custom, in my custom box, it might be in a box with other Star Wars. I have no idea where things are at this point. This is just the one that has stayed in my collection. So it was, of course, the first one that I received. Of course, again, the only thing that's really bugged me about this one over the years is the paint spot, and there's a bit on his robes here. And again, it's the only example I've seen where it's been like this. There's this bit that I don't think it was moulded properly, but it points straight down, and it prevents him from really standing up properly. But other than that, absolutely superb figure. As I say, I've had several, and this is really the only one that's had either of those issues, and even then it stands out as such a fantastic figure. And not only, you know, a fantastic figure, but actually a very easy one to acquire and a very cheap one to acquire nowadays. These were, of course, major peg warmers when the film first came out. On eBay now, of course, you can find them without any trouble whatsoever. £5–6, easy. That's the nice thing about the episode 1 line, I think. From what I've seen in general, they're not quite as expensive as a number of the other figures, the other lines of figures that you see on eBay nowadays. Of course, the whole Star Wars line of figures has become very, very expensive, but I think due to the unfortunate unpopularity of the episode 1 line, they're just that much more sort of easy and cheap to acquire at this point. So it's a superb figure. If you like Neimoidians or hate them, you can't deny it is a good figure. It is better than the Nute Gunray figure. It's better for customization. It's got better articulation. It's got nicer paintwork on it. It's just such a nice figure, and I can only wholeheartedly recommend that you pick one up for your collection. Again, not trying to be biased or anything. So that's it for the Rune Haako figure. We are, of course, just a couple of figures into our line of the, you know, Hasbro Neimoidian figures. It's funny, I always complain about the Neimoidians not getting enough figures, and in all fairness, I don't think they actually really do. There's a number of characters that still haven't been released, but actually, I was looking at them today and comparing it to a number of other species who've had, you know, I dare say even more characters released, and really, when you get right down to it, comparatively speaking, they've actually had a huge line of figures. Unfortunately, they're just spaced out. Quite, you know, widely between the two figures, and they're just, you know, not terribly popular characters, especially now that the Force Awakens has come out. They're more or less forgotten. So unfortunately, it's unlikely we'll probably ever see a Neimoidian figure again, which is bad because they still haven't made Tay Hao. But yes, going back, as I said, I wholeheartedly recommend picking up a Rune Haako. It's a great figure to have in your collection, and of course a great figure for customization, as I've shown in the past with a number of customs that I've both made and picked up over the years. So, thank you very much indeed for watching. Hit like, hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Plenty of new videos coming your way. Thank you, and I've been Quair Chan, you've been amazing, and may the Force and Neimoidians be with you.